Greetings, friends, and welcome to the opening of the week here on ChessDojo. Every week we study a different opening and practice it. The main way we study it is just by playing it and practicing it. And leading up to a tournament, usually on Sunday morning, where we then have a thematic tournament, new feature on chess.com, and it forces all of us to play that same opening against each other. And so that sort of like caps off a week of learning the opening. We see what we've gained. And then the next week we go on to something else. And, you know, some weeks the opening will be something that's right into your wheelhouse. And another week it'll be something that you're really unfamiliar with and that forces you to stretch in new ways. This week's opening of the week was selected via Twitter poll. So for once, you can't blame me if you think that it was a bad choice. Although there aren't really too many bad choices available for opening of the week. Everything here is pretty interesting. All right. So let's get into the Sicilian here. We've got a number of Super GM / World Champion games to look at today. In fact, I think there may be a World Champion in 5 out of 6 games or something like that that I've got planned for you. No, only 4 out of 6. 3 out of 6. 3 out of 6. Anyway, they're really good players. So we're going to see some high quality example games. Myself, I'm not an expert of the Sicilian, but, you know, why go find a lesson on this opening by somebody who really knows it when you could just watch me stammer around not knowing what I'm doing. And that way learn how to find your way around some other opening in the future, right? So Knight f3, e6. This move is characteristic of the Khan, and it anticipates the likely move d4 from white, in which case black will already have the d5 outpost covered with a pawn, which is often a good square for the white knight to go to in the center. The move also, just in general, by starting to fight for the move d5, by starting to fight for the square d5, black anticipates at some point in the game playing the move d5. And playing d5 is going to help you to counter white's pawn on e4. And many people know that Sicilians and Frenches have a certain overlap in their pawn structures, right? Because a lot of times in the Sicilian, let me play some other, well, I'll play e6 for now. A lot of times in the Sicilian, black will at some point try to counter white's central advantage by playing the move d5. And if white plays e5, you're straight into a famous French structure, which normally would come out of black playing d5 first. Having achieved d5, they then play c5 to undermine the e5 pawn. So to some extent, in the French, black plays d5 quickly, and if white plays e5, black will later play for c5. In the Sicilian, you play c5 quickly and immediately exchange the d pawn when it comes into the center, and then you spend a while trying to set up and prepare the move d5. Okay, so that leads to a number of similar structures in these openings. Also, if you got this kind of a structure here without these 4 pawns, right? Queenside majority of 3 and 2 for white, kingside majority of 4 and 3 for black. That's a structure that you can also get all the time from the French defense. For example, if you've got a d takes e4 kind of variation, you'll see black working to play the move c5. And when those pawns get traded again, you get that typical pawn structure of 4 on 3 on the king side for black, 3 on 2 for white. So all that to say that the French and the Sicilian are intimately linked in terms of structure, and an e6 Sicilian is looking straight at this possibility of playing d5. If white doesn't play the open Sicilian, which doesn't really matter to us this week, so I'll only say like one sentence about it, but if white doesn't play the open Sicilian, if they switch to a closed Sicilian or a King's Indian attack or something like that here with d3 and g3 and bishop g2 and so forth, in an e6 Sicilian, black's going to be reasonably well poised to play a quick d5 as well as their early c5. And again, you get positions in the King's Indian attack where you can't really tell if black started with the Sicilian or the French because it becomes exactly the same position. But for this week, we're going to be looking at the open variation of the Sicilian, and the con only really becomes the con once we're in the open variation. And so black's going to take, trading off white's d4 pawn. I don't need to explain why black takes too much. The point of playing c5 was to trade so that white wouldn't have this nice pawn center. White's doing it anyway, thinking that it is putting the white knight into a good position and giving white a lot of room in the center for the bishops and knights to come out. Queen as well is going to have room to tuck in the center. So it's going to give white space in the center. That's sort of what white's doing while trading their center pawn for the bishop pawn. And now with a6, we enter the actual con. This position here, by the way, will be the starting position for our tournament on Sunday this week. Right like this. So take a picture of that. That's where we're going to start. From this position, white has 3 different popular moves, which are really going to lead to different styles of games. We're going to see a couple games from each of them. But let's talk about this move a6 from black for a moment. What's the point of the move a6 here? Does anybody know? Welcome, move 11, for the 3rd time. Prevent his own light square bishop from coming in. Stop white from maybe playing knight b5 and aiming at the weak d6 square. Yeah. Yeah, a big piece of it is stopping white from using b5, especially for their knight. In this position, one of the most common development squares for the black queen is c7. And queen c7, knight b5 is quite awkward. And then as Potsto is saying, a6 could support the move b5. And having pawns on these 2 squares, this bishop, we really got to wonder where he's going right now. a6 is hoping that with b5, he can find a good home on b7, even though a6, you know, at the moment blocks him in even further. But this bishop's looking to come to b7 in a lot of variations of the con. And b5 is also a move which can help black to put pressure on the c file. That's the semi-open file for black. And the most classic counterplay or play for black in the open Sicilians comes along the c file. Same with the English opening for white. The most classic and simple positional plans come from using the one semi-open file that you have where you can put a rook on it and get some extra force and strength there compared to the opponent. And if they try and block that c file with a piece or a pawn on c3, it may be useful to black to have a pawn on b5 that can also come to b4 to soften up that file at some point. And Potsto, I'm pretty sure that the con and Taimanov can transpose to each other in some lines. Yeah. Pretty sure. But in fact, I won't know when we're transposing whether the opening is technically the con or the Taimanov at some point. Because to me, it'll be a position that you can reach from e6 Sicilians. I don't even know at some point why it would be or wouldn't be the Taimanov or the con. So don't expect me to get the nomenclature right or any of the moves. All right, so our first game here is Garry Kasparov. And the first of the 3 typical popular approaches from white that we're going to look at is c4. And c4 is going to clamp down on the 2 big pawn moves that black wanted to play in this position. So it's gaining space, and specifically it's gaining space while trying to keep the opponent from gaining space. So it's trying to say, I want all the space and you can have none of the space. Obviously it's not a developing move. So white is valuing, space over speed of development. And that may be, not in general that white's always going to do that, but white might just be saying these 2 moves from black are so important that I'm going to stop those 2 moves. And then I'll start developing more quickly. This situation of a center pawn on c4 and e4 for white is often called the Marazzi, as GP Bear is saying. And as Phyllis was saying, if white prevents b5, is black going to go into basically a hedgehog with b6 and bishop b7? And the answer is that is one option for black, right? At this point, they're very likely to have some form of a hedgehog structure, since the Maroczy doesn't really let them have anything else. And GP Bear asks, why might black want to have the queen on c7 in general in this opening, right? Since a6 was partly to stop knight b5, and I also mentioned that it's one of the most typical squares for the queen to be on. Well, for one thing, you do want some kind of square for your queen so that you can connect the rooks. So queens in general in chess want like quarterback type of squares where they're somewhere near the middle of the board, but not too far up, because you don't want to trade them if another piece attacks them, right? So you want to be protected. You want to be behind the line of your pawns and other pieces if possible. You like to be kind of central so you can aim in either direction. So you try and find some spot, kind of like c7, d7, e7 are the three best squares for a queen, or for white c2, d2, e2. In general, across thousands of different openings. It's kind of like sitting in the pocket. And the reason you don't want to just stick around on the square you're on is that then you interfere with the rooks. And in general, the queen wants to be on a flexible square where she can come in once the other pieces have laid some of the groundwork for her. But she also doesn't want to block her own pieces while she's waiting to get into the action. So if you think of the queen going to e7, you can see that that would be a square that's at the moment a little bit awkward for blocking this bishop, some variations even the knight. And if you go to d7, similarly, you might block this knight or this bishop. So that's why c7 is, that's one of the main reasons why c7 is better than d7 or e7. It's not even what she does there. It's just like she gets out of the way of stuff and she's still flexible because she hasn't like super committed herself to the queen side or the king side. That said, as somebody mentioned, or as GP was asking the initial question, sometimes you see this combined with the bishop on d6 for some kind of fancy threats on h2. Some really trappy tactical lines exist in this Sicilian Khan family. And the super GM games that I've picked for today don't include any of that bishop d6 to h2 kind of stuff. But it does exist, and that is something that as white you kind of have to watch out for at some point, because people will try and trick you with that early on. Okay. So c4 clamping down on some space, and we are now watching the great, the Garry Kasparov, 13th world champion. And he's playing against Francisco Vallejo Pons. He's now a 2700 Spanish player. At the time, was a little bit younger and was not quite 2700 yet. And there you get the queen on c7. And one of the things with queen c7 is it also helps you support the move knight c6, where sometimes if white trades it, you actually don't want to take back with either pawn. It messes up the structure from what you were trying to get. So often, one other reason for this queen c7 move is that you want to play knight c6, and if white takes, you actually want to recapture with your queen. So. Well, it was the dojo's choice, Ernst. This was a Twitter poll that selected this opening. And our Thursday rapid tournament this week is just normal chess Alexa. Neither an opening nor an endgame, just a normal tournament. All right, b6. So, yeah, seeing that sort of hedgehog come in. Bishop b7, threatening the e4 pawn. f3. So everything's very solid from white. And now already black can start looking for moves like d5. In the game, black develops the knight to c6. Let's just see what happens if d5 gets played. If white just straightforwardly trades a bunch of times and then tries knight to b5, opening up the queen's control over d5. Does black have any good move here with their queen attacked? Maybe queen e7? If black tries to defend stuff, it fails to this move because of knight c7, I'm pretty sure. If black takes the knight, then after queen takes d5, the rook's hanging and bishop b5 is coming, and black's also dead. So knight e7 would still be some kind of a move here. And I'm looking at like queen e2 here, but that unleashes this threat, and black could even take the knight. Queen d5, queen e3, bishop e2 looks very awkward. White needs a really good move. Oh, a king's gambit move. Get out of the way with the king. Oh, that's so good, actually. I love when people check me on the e file on the king's gambit, because then I can just move my king, which is really what I'm dying to do. All right, so a king's gambit move here, king f2, and it looks like black is still hurt, right? Bishop's hanging, pawn's hanging. White would love to bring this bishop out and play rook e1 quickly. What can black do? So bishop's somewhere. Bishop b6, threatening knight c7, and if pawn takes, bishop takes, it's just a massacre. Maybe the move bishop c6 is more reasonable by attacking this knight here. It'll avoid, you know, maybe the worst knockouts because that bishop can't go to b5 as easily. But even if white just plays knight d4, this is very awkward for black right now, actually, with the queen blocking this in. You don't want to give up the bishop pair here in the open. There's the f5 square, bishop c4, rook e1. It's just a very bad position for black, actually, at this point, with the simple knight d4. Okay, you were thinking queen a4. Yeah, there may be something fancier here after bishop c6. There may be some, you know, genius move here, like rook c1 trying to checkmate on c8 or something. Or maybe somehow you can play bishop b6 and sack the second bishop on b5 and just get the rook e1 out. But we don't want to spend an hour calculating this random position. So let's just say that white's position is good. And go back here and say, okay, we can't quite play d5 for black. It's too bad, but it's good to like test your limit like that, right? And see if you can do it. Because we said, look at all these moves white's played to get a stronger central position, right? A lot of moves that slowed down white's development. So you might say, hey, if you're playing moves like f3 and a3, I'm going to hit you where it hurts, right in the middle of d5, right? Boom, in the center. Boom, in the center, I said. Okay. The problem is, if we actually add up how many pieces are developed here, black's actually one piece behind white in developing the minor pieces. I guess the queen kind of compensates for it. But basically, black's not actually ahead in development. Because black has also played, you know, a6, a fancy-dancy little queen move. You know, c5 is a move that is emphasizing, you know, central pawns versus development. So black's not way behind in development like in some open Sicilian variations, but they're not ahead either. They're just kind of equal-ish in development, and d5 does not quite do it here. So pawns played knight to c6. Thank you, Logis. And Gary just plays bishop e2. d5 looks pretty solidly defended right now, though. Basically, when you start learning to play this opening, one thing that you have to do is just always calculate the move d5. If you're black or if you're white, d5 is sort of your baseline for what can either player do at the moment and how good or bad is, you know, are the d5 variations looking. Lets you know what they can or can't do. Thank you, Adriana. Do you know this opening we're doing this week? Whoa, more space over development. All right, so Gary was obviously valuing space in this game here. I mean, I would normally play moves. It's not to say my moves are good, right? But my instinct in a position like this is to play moves like castles, queen d2, so this bishop is better defended, and then put my rooks on maybe d1 and c1. I want all that like piece power getting involved right away. Did I get your raid? No? Sorry, I did not. But thank you for trying. We appreciate the effort anyway. If you were streaming, I'll send you a shout out. All right, so b4 is played. That's a maybe he didn't like the move bishop c5 coming for black, but I mean black just played rook b8. If bishop c5 were a big deal, black could have played it last move, right? So rook b8, it's a fancy move that I'm not going to try and figure out the reason for every single move. But I think b4 is just aggressively grabbing space, prioritizing it over bringing the rooks out. So we'll see bishop e7. Now the castle, rook comes to c1, knight e5 is played. A typical square for this knight to maneuver through since it doesn't have a lot of other choices in this opening. After O to O, bishop d6 should be an idea. Yeah, I wonder. Bishop d6. Yeah, if you go knight b5, does this queen have enough good squares to go to? Looks okay for black, right? I don't think white can sack like this. So that's not why black didn't play bishop d6. White doesn't have a knockout with knight b5 or anything. Could white play f4 here? Is the e4 solid enough to do it? g3 leads to a draw after bishop takes g3. b4. Yeah, I thought you might be asking about the move before Bladwing, but you're saying if white castled instead of playing b4. Maybe that makes a difference. So you want to see it here, here. F4. Takes. If the bishop takes, can black take here? Then e5, and everything's hanging. No, bishop could just recapture on e5. Okay, so queen d4, and then maybe black could just trade stuff. Yeah, you're right, Seth. Maybe black could just trade everything off, right? And do okay. And, whoa, genius rook b8 move. Was ready for all this. So Gary plays b4 before castling. Here, if black plays bishop d6, he has knight b5, so bishop d6 can't be played. Now black 10 spends a tempo on bishop e7. Now he castles. Now, if bishop d6, there isn't that bishop c5 move. So on bishop d6, probably Gary's plan would be f4 here. And then I'm guessing black's best thing would be to try this e5 move. And I don't see what white can do against e5, but probably it's fine for white somehow. Maybe just retreat the queen to d2. I just very much trust Gary, you guys can see. I'm like, he must have something here. Some reason why e5 is not a problem, even though I don't see why, because I see, you know, bishop takes e5, hitting these squares as a problem. But instinctively, it seems like white should have something. Potsto says b6 hangs. I suppose so. It's going to get risky in here. hits this. I guess white's basically just mopping up this position. Okay. So the game continues with normal castling moves. White puts the rook on c1, knight e5, takes more space, knight retreats, defend e4, which is now undefended. Here, if e5, white probably has knight f5, which is pretty good, and knight d5, which can be pretty good as well. Bishop a8. So we've got classic Maroczy bind versus hedgehog here, right? This pawn structure is just a typical one. I mean, it's a really classic pawn structure to know from the English opening and from the Sicilian. Okay, achieving e5 is usually very good for white. So one must wonder why not d6 from black here. Is there any reason to really not do that? And the answer is likely to be the move f5 here. With the knight on g6, this move becomes interesting with this pawn not defended, right? Even though white spent so much time grabbing space, now it seems like white's ahead of the game in terms of achieving their plans. It's seeming to happen pretty fast. If pawn takes, and then knight d5 is coming. Does e5 help black? The problem with e5, Paul, is that it gives white these moves knight d5 and knight f5. That's the main issue. But otherwise, I mean, e5 is a complicated move in the Sicilian. It comes up sometimes as a way to open the center, basically. When white's starting to pawn roll the king side, you'll often see this e5 kind of move. And when white plays e6, white hasn't played e6 yet. Oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about in the game, does this move e5 help black by opening the bishop? Yes. It does. It improves that bishop, but look what it does to this knight. You see, that knight is hurt. And this bishop was already decent because it was applying pressure usefully in the center. So e5 helps it, but it hurts the knight even more. And white often follows up by putting a piece on e4, either knight or bishop, and like deals with this. But yes, anytime you're playing e5 for white, you need to check whether or not this bishop is something that you can deal with or not. All right, Gary heads to the king side, and what's the plan? Maybe knight e4 next? Knight e4, and then you're looking at either knight g5 or rook f3 to h3. White might also just be threatening a move like f5 at some point. For the moment, there's queen e5. So it's not yet like a direct threat, but that's another plan that could come in for white. Okay, a5. That's not going to help black fast enough. I was so sure that a piece was coming to e4. Look at that. All right. Pawns wins a pawn. But white's got every piece amazing. Black's bishops aren't bad. There's just a little bit of a discoordination to it, and the king's about to get attacked, right? White's got a big space advantage here. There's a big attack coming in. f5 to gain some space. Knight g5 comes in, threatening mate in 1. If h6, then queen g6. Oh, no trade. No trade. All right. Pawns didn't get mated yet, right? If the best Gary could do was king h1 to avoid the bishop trade, it means he doesn't have a breakthrough yet. What a slick defensive maneuver, knight g8 to h6. Queen c8. h3. Oh, one of the most classic Kasparov moves of all. King h2, preparing his attacks. Getting off the diagonals of the bishops here. Now the bishop will live on b2. All right, slow motion attack coming in. What about queen to e8 here as a chance to defend? I assume we would not trade, but you guys can just check. There's no like 96, no nothing, right? Just retreat. I'm good, Hounds. Hope you are too, man. The attack's taking a while. If knight d3, it brings the rook to d3, right? So this trade's not looking great because of rook g3, and this square is very hard to defend. If you ever play g6, the knight's hanging. I agree, Seth. I think playing Kasparov was one of the absolute most scary things that could happen to a chess player. Okay, well, maybe queen e8, queen h4 doesn't change much. Black played b5, trying to make progress on this side. Gary plays both sides of the board. There comes that queen e8 move. And he just dodges out of it all the way back here. Oh, I didn't see that idea. I thought he would stay on the king side. But Gary plays the whole board. Look at that. He's trying to checkmate the king, and suddenly, what? He's playing for pressure on the c file? What's going on? It looks like it was, Jens. Good for you. You're on Gary's team, and I'm on the loser team. Oh, here comes the rook to g3. Oh, I told you about this, Francisco. At least there's no knight hanging on h6 now. By the way, if anyone wonders what happens if black plays g6, it's the same thing, this queen e5 move, right? And then you can't deal with this diagonal anymore. So rook g5 to defend it. Queen e5 threatening, rook g7 again. Queen f8. Takes. Oh! And he kills him on the other side. Look at that. Kills him on the other side. Poor Paco. Poor Paco. Yeah, he wants to play rook c8. Exactly right. If that rook ever comes off of b8, right? Then there's this kind of threat. If rook takes, mate in 1. And that's a dark square weakness for y'all. Courtesy of Jens, Chess, and Gary. So h6 was played, rook g3, staying on g7, king h7. Pawn's finally doing the rearrangement that Gary did so that his forces can cover this a little bit more conveniently without the king being tactically vulnerable from here. And now there's no queen h8 mate if he has to move the g-pawn for some reason. But still, he's essentially down this like pass pawn on the queen side, so it's tough. Ow. Oh, what? Oh, no. So, yeah. So it goes. Does this offer any defense, or was it already just over? I don't see a knockout here. Can he Zugzwang black in some way? Like, does king g1 Zugzwang black maybe? Or does black still have moves? Black still has, you know, king g8, king h7. So white still needs to find a way to win the game. But bishop e4, queen e6. Oh, Paco didn't see it coming. Oh, takes that too. And his king's nice and safe. GG on g7. Resigned. All right. That's our game number 1. Game number 2. Magnus versus Anand. Second most scary experience in chess, playing black against Magnus. But I feel like with his body language, Gary might have like pushed himself over the edge, even though Magnus is even a little bit better. You know, as far as like how much fear would be inspired. Okay, so here against c4. Last game we saw Paco just playing, you know, queen c7, b6, bishop b7, hedgehog style. Here Anand's going to attack e4 right away. You can't play e5 because of queen a5 check, winning the pawn. So he goes knight f6, attacking e4 immediately, and then bishop to b4, going after the e4 square and the possible doubled pawns. This is a much more precise, precision requiring and challenging approach from black, because white really has to like cover this pawn and be prepared for evaluating difficult decisions around bishop c3. Now, bishop c3 is a very risky move for black to play, having placed 6 out of 7 pawns on light squares, right? This guy's value has shot up really high, so you trade him off for some, you know, random knight just to give your opponent doubled pawns or even to win the e4 pawn, and sometimes it, you know, rebounds against you. So queen d3 from Magnus, defending e4 and d4 manually with the queen. She's like up there trying to like hold everything together at this wall that's supposed to restrain the opponent, but gotta worry that you're keeping it defended. Knight c6, trades it off, and Anand just takes back like this, inviting that endgame. Whew. And Maggie gives it to him. White doesn't have like a good move to avoid the queen trade, I don't think. You don't want to be spending time on moves like queen c2 in the opening. You could also play bishop d2 here as white. Looks very sensible to me, but it doesn't avoid the endgame, right? It develops your bishops faster, but it doesn't displace their king, so their pieces will develop faster as well. It's hard to say how much time you win or lose with queen d8 versus with bishop d2. Especially because with bishop d2, your opponent could also just sort of castle and wait on that trade there. So anyway, should white play knight c6 whenever black plays knight c6? I think that's partly a matter of taste, Paul, right? Like, would you be excited to play this position here as white, Paul? Jesse would be. It's a playable game for either side, but I don't know that it's clearly better or worse than, you know, a position you might get with a move like bishop e2 or bishop e3. You know, you'd like it, except not against Anand. Yeah. And we've got a question, wouldn't it be better to play b takes c6? Again, this move here, it's often a matter of taste, which way you take back. Like, I've seen people take back either way. And, you know, there's a line in the con with bishop d3, knight c6, where white often just takes right away. And here, black usually takes back with the b pawn instead of the d pawn, as we're seeing in this particular case. In this case here, if you take back with the b pawn, the one concern I have is that white might have a very strong move e5 here. And it's going to maybe cost you tempo on the knight, plus, you know, you don't get this nice d5 move that you wanted. Your structure is always going to be potentially crippled by white, or they can just keep their space advantage. But it's the time that we lose off of getting the knight kicked here that I'm a little bit suspicious or worried about. So in this position here, I think it may be a position where you do want to take with the D pawn, but often it may be about equal to take with the B pawn or the D pawn, and it's just kind of your choice which you want. You could make the bishop c3 concession, yes. Here, white doesn't need to double pawns if they don't want to. They could take with the queen. So you probably don't have time to take here and here. Certainly not knight e4, queen g7 looks bad. Yeah. So, so you can expect to recapture like this. And then if e5, knight e4, maybe there's no exploiting move because of queen a5. So maybe white just plays like bishop d3 here. But still, you've just, here you've traded your dark squared bishop for not enough, I would say. I could be wrong, but my take on this to you would be it's very dangerous to give up your dark squared bishop for what you've got here. You don't have anything approaching the counter advantages or positional setup of like, you know, pawns on dark squares, knight on coming to d4. I don't see anything here for black that to me would say like, sure, I could give up my dark squared bishop for this. But again, that's just my take. So d takes c6, we get the queen trade, and now e5. Even here, e5. And no knight e4 from Anand. So there's something here. I was expecting in this position bishop d2 from Maggie with the idea that if, you know, trades, knight e4, you can get back your pawn on g7. But e5, so what's his idea after knight e4? We have to wonder. I mean, it'd probably just be a3, losing a pawn and forcing the dark square bishop to trade, right? I don't see any other move to really play. I mean, bishop d2, knight takes d2 is just completely lame for white. Just easy equality for black, in my opinion, if not even better chances for black. So I'm going to say his plan must have been a3. The bishop can't retreat because the knight's hanging. So we force the trade, though we do lose a pawn. Now this is going to come out maybe here. Maybe try to get bishop b6 in. I mean, bishop a5, you know, controlling those dark squares. We might have to play knight a4 to be able to contain that move. Oh, and knight a4, we can also contain bishop b4 with this. Knight a4. I mean, this move here is interesting to me, c5, potentially. I wonder. It's complicated. I mean, I guess, you know, white's definitely down a pawn. And this bishop is definitely a problem. And black's knight and bishop are not well placed here. So, I don't know. It must have been his idea to do something like that. And it's probably just an evaluation, not a long calculation, that he was happy with that. Anand avoids it. Knight d7, bishop f4, makes the concession. And you will see the dark squared bishop get traded on c3 in some of these cons. So it can be a useful skill to have if you want to play this opening as white or black, to be able to judge when it is or isn't good to trade that dark squared bishop. Like, what do you guys think of this? Would you have traded on c3 or not? Who would have taken here? Who wouldn't have? It is also common in the Nimzo-Indian. Yeah, GP Bear. But if you mean, is it like an exclusively Nimzo-Indian thing? No. It's something that comes up in many other openings with bishop b4. You expected white to play f4. Yeah, f4 would be if you really needed to clamp down on e5 because there was lots of other action coming here. But here white wants, you know, just more freedom for the bishop. So a pawn on f4 that could get stuck there would block off diagonals from that bishop. So Anand's organizing his bishop, presumably playing with c5. Yeah, that's good for the bishop, good for the pawn structure. Wow, rook comes over here, pressuring g7. Wondering about rook h4 to g4, right? Knight f8. Yeah, I mean, eventually white does have rook h4 to g4, right? I mean, black can't put the rook on h7. That's a real plan, I think. It's kind of like the biggest weakness in black's position is this g7 pawn. It is from their World Championship match, Sombrero. Yeah, it's a real one. Hey, Long John Silver. Ooh, can't take on h6 because e5 is hit. He could play bishop takes g6, but he won't come out ahead because rook takes and g2 is hanging, right? So takes here, takes here. It's just a drawn opposite-colored bishop endgame. So rook h5 holding the e5 pawn. Bishop's still exerting pressure, but how is white going to make progress from here? I don't know. I don't know what white's doing. Slowly, slowly, something maybe. Right, I expected that pawn to eventually block that diagonal. Ooh, should that pawn have gone to a3? One wonders now, huh? Now can white take on h6? He still doesn't. So what's going on? If rook h6, of course, there's knight e5 still. Maybe if bishop h6, the rook comes back to h8. And then he doesn't have a good way to untangle these with knight e5 kind of threatened. What about bishop takes g6 now? Boldly say that black is better, maybe. I have to watch out for a tactic, right? Sneaky A pawn is going to be serious counterplay. No trade. No trade. All right, so now he's gained a pawn, but he didn't take this one. Take the other one, keeping opposite-colored bishops. This pawn structure is holding this bishop at bay. It's ready to do this, ready to take this. Looks very good for him. Black needs a real counterplay move. Bishop a4, like I was thinking before, threatening this rook d1 move. Rook e6, allowing it. Rook d1. Bishop takes a3, opening the a file. I hope that bishop doesn't get trapped. I assume it doesn't since I know that Magnus won this game, but yikes. I mean, that's one way of dealing with counterplay, right? Because if you come here and here, this a pawn is enough counterplay that you could draw or lose the game with 3 extra pawns on the king side. It doesn't really matter, right? So he gets rid of it, but now he has to not lose this bishop. If this goes to like c2, his bishop goes to where? Oh, his plan is to play this move. His plan is just pure, it's tactical and it works. If the king goes to a6, it blocks this rook forever. And if it comes to, you know, c6 or c8, rook here and checkmate, right? Basically, the king gets itself mated. So black can't go after that bishop. So black just goes after the a pawn with that rook. And now white could just move the king so that rook takes a2 isn't check. Bishop c2 played. If rook here, the bishop Does it escape like this? Yeah, on rook c2, bishop d2. Some kind of construction, maybe? Rook d8. Actually, just rook d6. You know, because white's taking this. They've got enough pass pawns to win the game over here. And this rook has just sort of gotten locked out of the game, actually. It's very much stuck. Badly placed now, weirdly, if white can just hold this together. Has there been a mistake from Carlsen to here? Not that I can tell, Bladwing. Not that a mortal like me can tell. So Anand brings the bishop this way. Now rook e7 comes in, right? And the king either interferes with the rook or gets mated. And, oh, Anand just resigned. Faced with a choice he didn't like anymore. Yeah. I mean, I assume getting mated is not like a real choice. There's just no way to defend this kind of a position. So it would have been here, I guess. And then rook takes, threatening bishop c5, and then king here. And I don't know if he has to resign this position. I want to play rook h7 to checkmate here, but the bishop's on it. Anyway, he's up 3 passed pawns and Anand resigned. I'm sure there's something bad still happening to this. This king position is still a problem. Does Stockfish or other engines help to analyze, or is it too abstract for engines? Oh, they can figure out the answer, Potstow. They just, I mean, they help to find the answer. They don't help you to understand the answer, unless you're really good already. I prefer to work, even if I don't know the answer. So that is Carlsen versus Anand from the World Championships. So Anand went for this endgame and was very close to holding it. Was definitely worse the whole time defending these pawns on the king side, but for a long time kind of held an almost standstill. But this position was always bad for him, and eventually Carlsen hurt him. At some point, he traded into the opposite colored bishop endgame when he was winning 1 or 2 pawns, and Anand couldn't find quite enough counterplay, though it was close. All right, game number 3. Now we get Anand as our representative of the world champions in this game here. And he's playing white against Vladimir Fedoseev, who's a very strong grandmaster, who's been as high as like 2690 FIDE or so. And here's our next move from white, bishop d3. Developing the bishop, preparing castling, and remaining flexible about whether or not to play c4 or knight takes c6 or different moves like that. So bishop c5 is a very common response from black here. You can also play other moves from black like knight c6 or queen c7. White hasn't really prevented any black move. Even knight f6 should be possible because, again, e5, queen a5 check. So many options, but this is one common option. And if you can challenge this knight and make it just step back as it does in this opening, that's a small accomplishment for black. In the Sicilian, open Sicilian, knights on b3 are usually a little bit worse than knights on d4. So you'll see there are some Sicilians, even some e6 Sicilians, that are built around basically just playing queen b6. Like this. You know, and the idea will be simply to get the opponent's knight to retreat from d4. So when white plays bishop d3, one of the weaknesses is that it blocks the queen's defense of the knight. One of the advantages is that the bishop's well placed for kingside mating attacks. So black tries to take advantage of the knight not being defended by coming here right away. White retreats it, and black plays bishop e7. You see black hasn't really lost any time because in 2 moves the bishop got to where it was likely to go, and white wasted a move retreating their knight to a worse square. So this is a nice approach from black. Okay. Anand develops, stops the move b5, which we talked about as one of black's big ideas, and rushes the pawn to a5 here instead of fighting for e4 and d5 with knight c3 here. So black played knight f6 thinking like, yeah, you're just stopping b5. And Anand surprises us all by going for a5. Normally, the knight will come here to fight for these two squares and make it hard for black to play a successful d5, which I assume black is going to play here. There's no way there's some tactical problem with d5. Yeah, he tries it. So we're going to get to see what it's like when white allows d5. You know, you spend 2 moves on your a pawn. Your opponent's allowed to strike in the center. Although, again, keep track of the development. White's played these 2 a pawn moves, but that doesn't mean white's ahead in development, right? I mean, it doesn't mean white's behind in development, right? Black is black, which costs you half a tempo. Black has played a6, which costs them another tempo, right? So, and black has played the Sicilian c5, which trades, you know, a bishop pawn for a center pawn. So it's black's not ahead in development, but they are able to play d5. Any thoughts on knight e2 now that the bishop is out? Maybe you mean knight d2 instead of knight b3. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, from this knight that was challenged in the center. Knight e2 looks totally playable. Totally playable. I think knight b3 is played because it's sort of like your opponent has to reposition the bishop again. So it doesn't win a tempo because the bishop goes back to e7, but let's say that like knight e2 would lose a tempo, right, compared to knight b3. So it's playable, you know, if you'd rather have your knight over on the king side, right, with castles king side, knight g3, that would be perfectly interesting to investigate. I doubt there's anything like losing about this knight move here, but this bishop is pretty good here, and we are sort of losing a tempo, so I imagine black has sufficient resources as well. Right? I don't think it like crushes black nor ruins the game for white. Okay, so a5, bishop b6, queen here, knight c3, just trying to defend that center that's falling apart. If d4, I think white can just take it. I think this bishop b5 check tactic should be here, right? Through all the chaos, it's still there for us. Yeah. Knight b3, bishop e7 will be seen in the next game, Sombrero. So we'll get to that too. Okay, so black could castle or trade on e4. Yeah, if black trades queens, you can see that black's used up a lot of energy to create a position that's better for white. And that's like an important thing that we were talking about during an episode of the Postmortem last week, that like when you take your energy and your opponent's like defending and you're like starting these trades, but they're recapturing. Look how white's knight just went from b1 to e4 while black was moving the d pawn twice, which is now traded off the board and you don't see it anymore, right? Then we trade again. We force a queen trade, right? And now look at the white pieces. Oops, right? You only want to like burn up all your energy like that when you're somehow winning something out of it, right? You don't want to just burn your energy for nothing. And here black's position is suddenly really trashy. So queen b4 was played by Fedoseev, hitting the bishop, point being it makes white retreat a piece. White still seems okay with that. Black wants this position to be really good for them. They want to play like e5, bishop e6. Yeah, they just don't seem to have the juice to gain any advantage for black out of this. Unless he was planning to take on b2 and then changed his mind about it. Should we see if that was black's plan? Queen b2. The queen's not trapped by any measure, so I imagine that Anand would have just castled, with maybe a pseudo threat of knight c4 to d6, depending on how black plays, just like a minor little positional tickle he could go for. So big options for black here would be to retreat the queen to f6 or to castle, I would think, are kind of like the big options. Let's say we just castle. Just put the rook on the open file. Send the queen back, because if she goes to c3, rook b3 is only helping white. We might play rook b3 anyway at some point here. And now black has a fundamental problem that they can't play rook d8, and like if we move this knight, they can't play bishop d7. So I don't know if white should play, you know, knight c4 or knight f3 or something, but there's a fundamental issue for black here about how to complete development. I guess this would be the simple answer to that question. Looks okay for black. Queen d3 to try and get some little weakness out of black. I don't know. I don't know who this is good for. Yeah, Steve's saying we could have played queen h5 right from the beginning as white to provoke one of those pawns to move. I chose to focus on getting the white rooks onto the two best files for them. So you can see, but I mean, I don't know if this is good or bad for white or black, honestly, at this point. Okay, so maybe he had in mind to take the pawn and changed his mind at some point. Because otherwise, and here, why not queen b2? Queen h5. Yeah, white's main advantage is covering the d8 square, and you don't see how to leverage it. The answer is you're not trying to like break through based on that. You're just leaving the black pieces passive. Black can't figure out what to do with their rooks, and you're trying to take over space the way I was playing. The way I was playing for white in this variation is kind of, I think, more or less the answer to what you try and do as white, right? Like, we come in here, now our knight's taking away these squares, and our bishop's taking away this square. And if they trade it, then we've got an unopposed dark squared bishop, right? Eventually, we can attack the b7 pawn, right? By moving the bishop at the right time, or playing queen c7, or something like that. If the black rooks just stay on a8 and f8 forever, while white's, you know, developing this kind of stuff, white will eventually have some nice options that start to appear for them. Okay, so now, I don't know if I like this f5. I don't understand how black's playing this opening really, because it feels like they're not really quickly solving the issue of developing these two pieces. And I guess without f5, they can't play bishop d7 because of bishop b6. So that explains why that move was played. And now it gets out. But now, of course, since f5 has been played, this bishop is not good against f5. It's better off here. Attacking e6 a couple times. Not taking e6. Maybe because of queen g5. Also, the pawn on c3 would be hanging, so black could always just get their pawn back. Okay, so this position here, black has actually managed to activate both bishops and even sort of the rooks here. Since they can't use d8, he's creating action elsewhere with this f-pawn. It makes sense. All perspectives, Levy, all perspectives. Opening of the week is always something that we're, in general, as a club, we're looking to be able to play it for white and for black, or to understand it from both sides. Now, you may end up incorporating openings of the week into your own repertoires only with white or only with black in the future, which is fine. But for this 1 week that we look at them together, we're looking at it from any direction. Okay, so f3. Complicated move I don't understand. I somewhat favor white in this position, but I like that Fedoseev has turned the game into a mess. I do appreciate that. Pawn's hanging, threatens checkmate, h6. Poor queen. I guess that was her only square. Takes f8. Takes, whoa. What? I guess white's up a full rook at this point, but they can't keep it. If they move the rook, the bishop on f8 gets captured anyway, so they just remove one pawn at the cost of a tempo, but that pawn was the one that was providing pawn cover for the black king, so it's quite a valuable pawn. And the messed up position that's resulting here, black is up a pawn, but the king's really open and the white pieces are more centralized. Okay, so bishop g7 might be genius. This position looks so complicated. I was afraid for white as well. Like maybe black's just doing enough with those bishops, but bishop g7, that was nice. If the bishop had recaptured, then rook e1 and black doesn't capture the rook, white stays up in exchange, though that may be playable for black to have that bishop, who knows? So we get to this position. It looks good for white. Rook d3, queen h7. Also, there's a threat of queen e6, which may or may not lead to mate. Defends e6, queen h4, and just trades that bishop. Huh. Surprisingly calm. I guess black's bishop was better than white's at this point, so that partly explains it. And then this move shocked me when I first looked through this game. That white was willing to trade queens in a position where I would be playing for checkmate. And then black doesn't even take it. But I guess if black goes into the endgame, what I realized is this rook covers kingside and queenside at once. This pawn obviously is wrapped up, so white's up and outside passed pawn here. And idea to play h5 and rook h4 could be extremely strong. So it's, perhaps also close to losing for black. So black improves the rook to stop the h-pawn from coming. Rook on the fourth rank again. And the h-pawn's running. Rook defends. Look at that. Even without the b-pawn, white's got this queenside covered here, but e5 is a great move. Nice. And now white's just too fast, huh? All right, black resigned here. The rook can sack for the a-pawn, and then the f-pawn will have queened before the b-pawn. So, yeah, this one's queening almost as fast as this. Great game from Anand. Great game from Anand. Yeah, at the moment, Shark, we are just testing out this Gauntlet prize pot thing, collecting donations towards the Gauntlet prize as opposed to towards other dojo purposes. And as that pot grows, we should be able to encourage ever more exciting players to come participate in that show as contestants. Does black ever win, Seth? Well, in the games that I looked at, which were played by 2780 plus players, basically no. But they do. Not always, Seth. In theory, all donations during the gauntlet will be going to the prize for the gauntlet. But right now, I'm just testing out this widget to see you know, if it works in advance of next Saturday's shows, I just want it to, you just want to iron out any kinks with it so that I know it's working well. And hoping to incorporate that into those shows on Saturday well. So, you know, if any donations come in during this show today, I will gladly give them to the Gauntlet prize, just as a way for me to test this out. Excellent. Thank you, Shark. I appreciate it. All right, so another game with bishop d3, and here we're going to see the bishop go to a7 instead of e7 like last game. Now, this is going to create great pressure against f2, but it leaves potentially the kingside dark squares a little bit weak. And I have at times played the same move that you're going to see from Karjakin here, queen g4. It's a typical move to play in the opening when your opponent develops the bishop quickly from f8, right? We want to attack g7 and try and provoke that pawn to go to g6. And if it does go to g6, which Fabi did not move it to g6, but if it does go to g6, then this bishop on a7 might be missed on the king side. All right, let's see if that worked. It looks like it ticked up, right? It looks like it ticked up on Seth's donation, but it didn't properly count the bits as pennies, right? So I think, and I appreciate you guys testing that, I think that it's correctly counting donations and not correctly counting bits, right? We'll see. Why not knight f6? Knight f6 is what was played in the game, but you might mean on the move before here. Why not play knight f6 as blacks to avoid queen g4? Because you do have knight d5 as a square. It's a good question, Levy. And I think the answer is white would actually play e5 here, though, grabbing that space to the king side. Even though the knight can go to a decent square here, when white falls with queen g4, this threat on g7 is just super annoying. It's just super annoying. I don't think I see a move that I like for black in response to queen g4. So even though knight d5 is acceptable and, you know, on c4, maybe you still have knight b4, maybe this knight's not out of the game, concretely, I don't see a good answer to queen g4 here. If you castle, bishop h6 looks rough. And if you play g6, then, you know, I just don't like that position. Weakening all the dark squares. Bishop can come to g5 or h6 in response. And yeah, I don't like anything here. So Fabi chose to play knight c6, and on queen g4 he just played knight f6, offering the pawn sack, and Sergey said no thanks. Now, when I've played queen g4, it was always because I was willing to take on g7. I never played queen g4 to retreat. So I don't know how bad this would be. I mean, Jesse also has pointed out that I've grubbed some pawns, too many at times. But is there some devastating follow-up for black here? I don't know. I would expect the move knight e5, looking at like f3 and g4 and stuff, just bringing more pieces towards the king side. But I don't, you know, it doesn't obviously KO white. It may eventually KO white. I don't know. I can't see far ahead to know for sure here. Oh, God, that's a tough question for me, Foos. I don't think I can answer that properly. Just like I can only guess at why he didn't take on g7. Okay, so king h1, looking to play f4, e5. Bishop g5 winning in that position. I was thinking of bishop g5 there. Shark, yeah. And I was thinking that black might be able to play this move. But I think not. I think it doesn't exactly work. Because white has like h4 after the knight moves, and the knight doesn't have a good move here. Here, then you'd have to do this, but now it's not good enough. So bishop g5, I guess you can play. I'd been thinking that knight f3 might crush it. But it's not going to win for white either, because black has knight g4, rook g6. Two simple moves, so to speak, to not lose a piece. So there's no way that this just wins. But yeah, it's a possible move that looks very risky and complicated. Okay, so queen g3, d6, king h1 to play f4, e5 to be ready for it and trade when it comes. Knight h5, queen f3. Okay, Fabi's fighting very, very actively for control of the very move that white wants, and he's happy to take on this sort of Sveshnikov d6 e5 pawn structure, which you also see in the Najdorf, knowing that his bishop's already out on this nice diagonal and it's not stuck on e7. So in the Sveshnikov, some of you may know this d5 square is very weak, but if you can get the bad bishop out from f6 to b6 to c5, you'll often have a lot of counterplay on the dark squares eventually, even if white does get the d5 outpost. So here the bishop's kind of outside of that structure, and so the move e5 as played here by Fabi is even more palatable for black and safer as far as the dynamic counterplay is even more likely to be there if white occupies d5. Feel like everything's going well for black, huh, Levy? Yeah, black seems to be doing all right. And g3 fighting desperately for control of these dark squares that black was slipping into more and more. And I think black was threatening a very, very unpleasant bishop g4 here, if you guys are familiar with that pattern, which sometimes traps a whole queen. So g3, Karjakin's just fighting to be in the game. Queen trade comes in. Rook c8 to stop knight c7. There's just nothing special for white here. You've got the d5 square, but black's got counterplay. Defending d6. That knight maneuver to c4 was nice by Sergey. See? Bad piece, right? Totally limited. Wants to be on these kind of squares. Brings it while that knight's coming back from h5. This looks like a Sveshnikov, right? Except that it's a knight for knight trade and the bishops are still on the board here. But if white had room for this bishop, I would think white would have a small structural advantage still, but they haven't yet found a way to use that bishop. Found somewhere to put it. Trade. p4, rook d1. Oh, white is not better if black has this attack on g3. Looks like Fabi's not even going to try and win it. His extra pawn is a double isolated f pawn. I mean, his pawns were never a problem as far as defending them, but I guess it's really hard to ever win an endgame when this is your pawn structure. In that sense, if he wanted to win, he would have to never trade off his bishop pair. But these white pieces are just in the center. You can't play this whole game without ever trading them, right? White has knight d6, knight f5, whatever. It's balanced, I guess. Yeah, balanced still. Okay, on to game 5. Here we've got Kasparov against the tourist, Sergey the tourist Movsesian. Let's see if he can send him packing. He did a pretty good job in our first game against Vallejo pawns. But now you see Kasparov using a different variation. Last time he played c4, now he's playing the knight c3 variation. It's our first time seeing the knight c3 line. Knight c6, trades it. Again, here, taking with your queen or your b pawn is kind of a matter of taste. I don't think many people play d takes c6 in this position, though I would say that's also a matter of taste. It looks playable. D takes c6, just saying you're going to play e5 to bring out the bishop that way. People have most often played queen takes c6 against me in this position. And I would guess it's the most popular move, but okay. Plays like this. Oh, no. He's trying to coffee house Gary with this queen and bishop stuff. Okay. If you take Gary's pawn, most likely he's going to play e5 against you. And then you take, and this. And if you know that series of kids' books, like if you give a mouse a cookie, and then basically the mouse asks for, you know, milk, and then with like milk, it wants like a bath, and it just like goes on, and it wants like 100 things from you. If you give Gary the initiative, you get the whole book, and it ends with you're checkmated, not with starting over. So I'm pretty sure you can't take on f4 against Gary because e5 will come and he'll blow it all open. So h6 is not a promising move from black either here. But what are you supposed to do with this weird bishop pawn construction? I mean, if you can't even take on f4, what are you trying to do? You'd think maybe castle. Is Gary going to play f5 now and sort of leave both those pieces out of the game for the moment? Then you have to come here to deal with this. But g4 comes, h6. Sorry, guys, I'm calculating like f6, so it's not easy to figure out what's coming here. This is like a typical kind of pawn storm you can get with kings both castled on the king side in the Sicilian. And sometimes black gets slaughtered, and sometimes the long diagonals in the middle of the board open up, and white gets slaughtered before they can get to the black king. I don't know. I still don't know if this is working for white or not. But it feels like not quite. It feels like not quite. And then there's g5 takes here, and then like f6 is another variation for white here, right? a5, bishop a6 for black. They could try that, Steve. At the moment, they can't yet because white's got too many pieces on this diagonal. d6 in that line was also letting the queen come this way, and the bishop blocked this diagonal on e6. Oh, how about this? This, check, and if the knight blocks, just here. And if d5, I guess there are some complications, but this king is in a lot of danger. We're threatening to win the queen. I don't know. It looks scary. It looks scary. What don't I like about f6? Just, I just couldn't find exactly how to win this for white. I wasn't sure from here what to do. I mean, I want to play some combination of these moves, or maybe just like here with rook h1, but now my bishop's still here. Maybe I should have taken with my bishop instead of my pawn to develop like this. Maybe this was better to come out faster with the bishop. Why is the bishop still on c8? Yeah, because he blocked in his bishop. You know, he chose to play bishop d6. I played f5 for white, then bring the bishop back so that on bishop g5 the knight's defended, and preparing d5. There just isn't time. Like putting it here is not good enough right now. So he needs to counter in the center. So he plays h6. I suppose castling would be a major alternative. You know, trying to get this bishop out is a hard task against this pawn structure. You have to figure out how you want to set up this pawn structure as well in figuring out how to get out this bishop. So I think I do feel though that f5 is very promising for white. I may or may not have found like the right continuation there or how to like knock black out, but I think f5 is the right move for white here. And transferring play to a pawn storm, because this is going to be slow to untangle these pieces and try and blow open the king on the diagonals. So, okay, so in the game, h6 gets played. Let's see what Gary does. Says, well, you're not getting any closer to having a good position, so he plays bishop d2, black castles, and now he plays f5. Oh, I could have just played 2 moves ahead, and then I would have known without having to figure it out for myself. But it's good to try. It's good to try. That's how it actually sinks in. Okay. So that also tells you the reason he's not yet playing f5 is because if black takes, he has e5 as long as the king's here. As soon as the king castles, now he doesn't want ef4 to be played anymore because he doesn't have the e5 trick, and he's ready to just switch to a pawn storm using the space from the f pawn. Yeah, I wanted to play this in some lines too. No g-pawn, but some threats nonetheless. Bishop h6 was threatened. King moves. Can you go rook takes g7? Not yet. Oh, he wants to go rook takes g7 though. He wants to go rook takes g7. And I know this isn't what you were talking about, Steve, but it still made me think of something. So I'm going to say that if queen a7, white can still play rook takes g7. And this is a relevant defense because it's trying to get the queen off of h6. But after rook g7, if queen takes queen, you can play rook check, king here, rook takes here, check, here, and then recapture the queen, right? And of course, the point of this whole thing is to play queen h6, check. King here, check. If here, queen f7 mate. And whatever, you know, 10 million ways to win from here. The point of h6 was, I think, that it slows down the g4, g5 pawn storm, which Gary then didn't choose to use here. Since that pawn storm's been slowed down, and since bishop g5 isn't threatened, he doesn't have to deal with this either. So Gary chooses to use h6 as a hook and just go after the black king side with his pieces like this. Knight g8 to defend h6. Yeah, that's sad. How about just f6 now, right? What are you going to do about f6? Oh! Oh! Sergey, I could have told you f6 was coming. Oh, no. This is just absolute brutality. Was this game before or after the tourist comments? I wonder. Oh, no. This is bad. This is bad. This game is from a simultaneous exhibition. Gary Kasparov was so good at chess, folks, that he played multiple simultaneous exhibitions with a clock, you know, and classical time control against like 4 other grandmasters. That's how good he was. That's something Carlsen hasn't done really, has he? He should do that. We need to see if he can do that. Like, can Carlsen beat the Czech Republic? Can Carlsen beat Israel? We need to know. We need to know. You want to be the greatest ever, Carlsen. Stop playing rapid chess with the same bozos that you've already beaten 100 times. And let's see if you can beat 4 of them at once with the clock ticking, like Gary did. Oh, what a brutality for Sergey. That's bad news. He got F6'd, and it was a simul. Since it was a simul, Gary probably played F6 instantly. He was probably just like, you know what? I know F6 is good. Gotta go with instincts in a simul. F6. Walk to the next board with some scornful look on the face. Man, Gary's facial expressions would make you just cry. Yeah, Levy. The king tucks of Gary. Remember that other game? He had to play king h1, but even after playing king h1, he then played h3, king h2 to put his king on the perfect square before he attacked. Remember that? Because that's where he really wants his king. He loves to do that. h3, king h2. No, this is 2001. This is not a kid. This is a real GM. This is a real 2650 to 2700 GM getting beaten in a 4-board simul. It is possible, Levy. He beat the Israeli Olympiad team in a simul, among other simul victories. And he scored stuff like, 2.5 out of 4 or 3 out of 4. He can't just win every game against GMs, but it is still straight up amazing. I don't believe blindfolded, no. Okay, so now every white piece flows to the poor black king. Oh, God. Boom. Jack. Rook f6 to threaten mate in 1. While that bishop on c3 is just still dangling there. d5. Check. Oh! Goodness gracious, Gary. Mercy. Won't even take the poor guy's queen. What? Oh. Takes here. Yeah, whatever. Gary's got the extra queen and the king's open. He went on to win this game. Jesus. Sergey just kept playing moves because it was a simul to try and see if he could use up a few more seconds of Gary's thought. And Gary was probably giving him the put my jacket back on, roll up my watch kind of stuff, put my watch back on that's on the table. But then he has to go to the other board where he's still playing and take his coat off because he's still playing that guy. But then when he goes to Movzezun's board, he puts his coat back on and gives him why are you still playing? Whew. Ouch. Smoked. So, you see, guys, you're not going to see a lot of queen c7, bishop d6 at the super GM level. But at the amateur level, you will see a lot of queen c7, bishop d6 kind of lines in the con, and it's very, very tricky. It'll trip up a lot of, you trip up a lot of people with these lines. They're very hard to figure out. Do you play g3? Do you play h3? Do you play f4? Very, very tricky. But you can't do that against a guy like Gary. He just king h1's you, right? And you're like, oh yeah, I can never take on f4 because of e5. If you ever castle, he plays that f5, and then just the pure violence. I mean, queen e3 threatening rook g7, f6, just. Yeah, as far as I know, I haven't heard of Magnus giving simuls to GMs. But that's the next frontier for you, Magnus. Having been reminded of the fact that Gary could do it, I'm reminded of the fact that you should be able to try it too. All right, here's our last game. And we've got another pair of just absolutely fantastic players here, Ivanchuk and Nakamura. A high-class game as well. Getting into the con here, something that Nakamura plays very well. Bishop d3. So we start with knight c3, then bishop d3, knight f6, f4. An aggressive line from Ivanchuk. I've normally seen people play bishop e3 and castles in this position. So nice, an aggressive move. If knight c6 gets played, challenging this d4 square, which is quite weak for white here, both on the diagonal and with the queen blocked by the bishop, presumably he'll just trade it. Yeah, you guys can bet on who wins if you want. If there's a moderator around to set that up for you. Okay, and here we get another example of what I wanted you guys to know is very important. These questions about when and if you want to trade the dark squared bishop for the knight are huge. Very important evaluation to be, experienced or reasonably good at making if you're playing this opening for white or for black. So black does it and then doesn't spend the time grabbing the pawn. He knows this pawn's already basically worthless, so he doesn't take it. This pawn structure is now garbage, and he immediately rushes to start defending dark squares against this predator. And the predator comes out anyway. So he's not threatening bishop d6, queen d6, bishop b5 check because of king e7. That's slick. But he does have the idea of maybe just playing e5, like cracking that square and the king can't castle here. By the way, one reason why white plays knight b3 here, folks, which may look... Remember I told you, like, if as black you can force the knight to retreat, that's like a good thing, and white would normally not want to retreat that knight, and he does it himself. I think it's because if he castles here, it's awkward to meet even the bishop just retreating back here. I think that's probably why. Or maybe queen b6. So he plays knight b3 because he needs that to be able to castle here, and it defends the rook against, a queen fork on c3. So we get this position, bishop goes to a3, rook d8, white gets castled. In this position, let's just take a quick, verbal poll. Do you guys like the unopposed dark squared bishops or the terrible c-file? Do you favor black or white here? Do you like Nakamura's decision to trade on c3? Or, of course, it's an option to say, it's too close to call. You think it's neither particularly good nor bad. It's just It's just an option. How are you guys feeling here? I'm a big proponent of bishops. I've had this position more often with white than with black. I've let people take on c3 because I'm like bishops, bishops, bishops. And I've seen that sometimes you get stuck. You don't have the dynamism. Your pawn structure's frozen up. The opponent plays, a strategy that contains you on the dark squares. And, eventually your position starts to get dragged down by its structure. But at this point, I would guess... I don't know. I'm gonna go with Paul's answer, which is I don't know if white or black should be favored here. I feel like normally I would choose the white position, but if I were white here, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do. Probably checkmate this king somehow, but I don't know how to do it. Okay, Ivanchuk had a plan for how to do it, I guess. Let's learn. Rook g3. Okay. So I guess the idea is to either play f5, queen h6, or to play e5, sacking a pawn and exploding everything, and then queen h6. Actually, that looks better. That looks better than f5. f5, you just lack all dynamism for white, right? Once you play f5, your bishop on d3 is dead. Black just plays knight e5 because he doesn't care if you take on e6. So it's probably e5 is kind of the idea. Maybe with king h1 first. Okay, so black goes king h8. Normally, I was going to say, it's a big choice. Do you want to have access to running away, or do you want to commit to hiding? But king f8, e5 looks just brutal. Don't forget about him. All right, so this is coming. Should be 7, f5. Oh, I was wrong. I thought white was trying to line up an e5 pawn sack. White's threatening rook takes g7 immediately here. So I guess knight e5 isn't good because of rook g7, king g7, queen g5 check. Just show you guys the idea. on the board for anyone who's never seen this before. Black loses all control of the dark squares. It's still like a small sacrifice, right? Because we gave a rook for a knight and a pawn. But the attack continues. Black can go either way with the king. Let's say here, white has to... Actually, now white maybe doesn't even take, but plays fe, because the knight maybe can't get away. And you threaten queen takes e5. Yikes. Yikes. This is quite an attack that's coming in here. This is quite an attack coming in. So white's going to recapture a knight as well for the rook sack at some point here, right? White's also got 1 or 2 pawns, and the king's just getting destroyed. So this is not going to be survivable for black if they allow rook takes g7 here. So rook g8 is played to defend g7. Queen g5 doesn't seem to threaten anything. Black plays e5. Big question would be why not knight e5, but... e5, queen h4. Okay, I don't really know what Ivanchuk has in mind here. Naka sets up his pieces and breaks in the center. Yeah, how does white get past that knight with like 3 bad minor pieces right now all tucked away? It's so complicated. I guess it's not that complicated. This knight can't fight for e4, so white wants to trade the bishops and then bring the knight to e4 and trade f6. Okay, so d5 is maybe not even helping black here. We'll see. Yikes. King's very open. g5. Now, if you take, you know, you get to see how sometimes the opponent gets strong counterattacks. Although I don't even know if this works for black. I mean, if the white king just flees, I'm not sure that black's okay here. But Ivanchuk played f6, which looks potentially even much stronger. It attacks this knight and it opens up this bishop if black doesn't trade the bishop. And if black does trade the bishop, they bring the knight to a good square where it helps control these things. So, yeah, Paul, I guess black wants to lock the pawn structure and there's no way it's going to get locked, right? White's got a double lever going on. There goes the pawn structure. Rook can't take because of checkmate. All right, well, the white king's really exposed. I mean, I would be worried here. I don't even know that white's better or anything. I would be very scared. I mean, the black king is obviously scared as well as the white king, but technically white is up 1 pawn right now, this h2 pawn, and you see these pawns versus these. It's not really clear who's better to me. I mean, I know Ivanchuk spent a lot of energy trying to create this position, so like in theory he wanted this, but it is hard for me to evaluate. This knight stops rook d1, I guess. If e4, the rook can just take it, so white's got that covered. Oh, now that bishop becomes good, finally. Or, I mean, more obvious that it's good. I hope white's got a threat here, because the knight is hanging. Maybe rook c6. Could this be white's threat? I mean, at first I wanted to play rook f7 or rook takes g6, right? But maybe it's just this stupid move, just plopping over onto the queen side. Because the bad thing about rook f7 and rook g6 is they both let this rook move. But this rook is straight up trapped. Maybe we should make our point like this. But that does allow queen c5, taking the bishop, right? But yeah, we just want to actually trap the piece. I think this is the right answer. Okay, so white has a threat. Bishop e5, threatening rook c6. Rook d5 is played. Rook c6 got played anyway. Nice. Trade, trade. Ooh, cleans up the pawn and won't even trade. Fancy, fancy, pantsy. If king here, rook check it, he's got to sack back his queen. That was unnecessarily fancy by white, right? Who could obviously have played queen g7, king g7, rook e4, and then go on to win the endgame like this. and he's just like, let me allow rook g5 check, seemingly the only trap black is still playing for, leaving the queen hanging. Fancy pantsy, boom, boom, check, resigned. Whoo, smoked again. So white's done very, very well in the games that I happened to pick for today. I just didn't insist on picking a balance of wins and losses. I just picked like the highest quality, highest rated games that I could that were played at sort of classical time controls. And, you know, a sampling of both 5 knight to c3, 5 bishop to d3, and 5 c4. And hopefully that gives you like a first look at what the Con Sicilian offers as far as, you know, strategies and tactics for white and black. And this way we got to just watch phenomenal games all day. So that was kind of the overriding concept. Now you'll need to go out there and practice this opening a whole bunch if you want to start getting some sense of how to play it and which way you want to play, right? Like, do you want to play with like the Maroczy bind kind of structure, as white is going to be very different than playing these piece versions with bishop d3 and knight c3 and maybe a development lead for white. And you guys are going to have to toy around with knight c6 and the 3 different ways for black to maybe recapture if white trades. And, you know, and then these questions of the bishop sometimes trading for a knight on c3 and when that is good or bad. Start calibrating your own sense of, you know, when you do or don't like that for black or white, a trade on c3. And our opening of the week thematic tournament will be next Sunday.